Welcome to the February interview of Psych Soc O'Clock. Today I'm here with Professor Ben Jones, who is a professor in the Institute of Neuroscience and Psychology at the University of Glasgow, and he runs the Face Research Lab with Dr. Lisa Debrin. Hello, how are you?
Fine, thanks, and how are you?
Yeah, good.
Psych Soc O'Clock's a good name for a podcast,
thank you.
I think. Did you come up with that, or was that?
It was the only name that got suggested. It was my one as a joke, but people seem to quite like it, so
Yeah,
stuck with
works.
it. I've got some icebreaker questions.
Go for it.
I think I've got I'll do the one I've got prep for. So, what is your favourite love song?
That's quite a tricky one because I'm a really big music fan, and there's a lot of good love songs. I would probably say I like disco a lot, so I would say I Feel Love, Donna Summer.
Ah, okay, that
kind of captures the kind of hedonistic aspects of falling in love for the first time or whatever.
Yeah.
But then at the other end of the spectrum, there's also things like Small Town Boy by Bronski Beat, which is about a guy growing up gay in a homophobic small Scottish town.
Wow.
In the 70s and 80s. So that's kind of a love song about love that maybe not everyone around you kind of gets.
Yeah.
But it's also quite anthemic and uplifting at the same time.
Sounds really beautiful. I think my one is I really like Al Green, Stay With Me.
Oh, good choice. Yeah, anything by Al Green's pretty amazing.
So, in the Face Lab, what kind of thing does your research include?
What do we do? Well, most of what we do is to do with faces, as the name implies, although we also do quite a lot of stuff with voices and a little bit of stuff with bodies. And even some stuff with sort of body odours, although that's less pleasant and harder to do.
Yeah.
But really what we're interested in is what kind of characteristics shape first impressions that people form about people. So how people look or sound or move or smell influence how people think about them when they meet them for the first time. And particularly a lot of our work focuses on sort of romantic attraction or sexual attraction. So what makes certain types of faces particularly attractive and other types of faces kind of relatively, I don't want to say unattractive, but it's less attractive is maybe the way to say it.
Yeah. Do you find that there is an overwhelming preference for a certain type of face in either sex?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that really comes out of particularly a lot of the kind of early work on attractiveness, or facial attractiveness in particular, is this idea that there's certain types of characteristics that people find that pretty much everybody finds attractive. So a good example of that would maybe be, just looking healthy, having a sort of healthy glow tends to be more attractive than having the kind of unhealthy looking pallor that I've developed. But also there's other things that you generally find attractive in faces. So most people generally find that if you take a woman's face and you exaggerate the kind of female sex typical characteristics of it, so you make the chin a little bit smaller, you make the brow a little bit smaller, you make the eyes bigger and the lips kind of fuller and plumper. Most people will agree that makes the face look slightly more attractive. Curiously, you don't seem to see the same thing for male faces. If you exaggerate the male sex characteristics in a male face, so you make the brow heavier, you make the jaw heavier, you make the eyes kind of beadier and a little bit more thuggish looking. You make the guy look much more aggressive and much more dominant looking. People perceive him to be more high status, but women seem a little bit more split on whether or not that makes him more attractive or less attractive.
What is kind of the opinion of women on more feminine, masculine faces? Because I think some people like the
it's kind of
pretty boy kind of.
Yeah, you do sort of see that. You see that some women seem to be more attracted to sort of manly looking guys. Some women attracted to the kind of softer features of the kind of more of a sort of boy band kind of look, sort of Justin Bieber type look. We don't really know why that seems to be the case. For a long time, people argued that this was to do with changes in women's menstrual cycle, that women would be more attracted, women became more attracted to these kind of manly men, masculine guys around ovulation when they're most fertile. That was sparked partly by a really influential paper in the journal Nature by one of our colleagues, Ian Pentonvoke, now at Bristol University, but it was work he did when he was at the University of St Andrews. More recent work that we've done in our lab with much larger samples, so Ian's original study tested, I think, like 25 women or something. We tested nearly 600, and we found very little evidence that this was the case. That the type of men that women were attracted to changed over the menstrual cycle in that kind of way. So I think if it does change over the menstrual cycle, it changes really, really subtly and isn't probably something to sort of worry about or think about too much. I think in the past, the influence of these kind of hormonal effects has been really overstated. So that sort of brings you back to the question of why some women are attracted to very masculine guys and other women are attracted to more sort of feminine guys.
Yeah.
We don't really know. It could be to do with experience. The curious thing about it is it doesn't seem to be specific to just faces or even just vision. So we've done work where we assess women's preferences. This was done with straight women. Assess women's preferences for masculine characteristics in men's faces, masculine characteristics in men's voices, so we can raise the pitch or lower the pitch to make them sound more or less masculine. And also use these synthetic pheromones, which are sort of chemicals that people produce in things like body odour. And there's some of those pheromones that men produce in greater quantities or greater concentrations than women do. And they kind of really smell like boys, actually. Like they have a very strong, pungent smell.
Like a teenager's room or something.
Yeah, like sweaty socks.
Nice.
We asked people, and we used those to assess preference for sort of masculine odours. And what we tended to find was that, the women that really didn't like the masculine odours also didn't like masculine faces or voices.
Okay.
The women that were... We didn't find very many women that liked the sort of smell of sweaty boys' rooms, but the ones that were more tolerant of it tended to be the ones that liked the masculine. So there's clearly almost something like almost like a personality trait. The amount that women are attracted to kind of masculine guys in general. And we've seen some hints in our work that might be to do with sort of learning parental characteristics or paternal characteristics, or it might just be to do with kind of everyday experience. But yeah, it's one of the things that we're really struggling to sort of wrap our heads around and find out, and that's despite having looked at it for nearly 20 years now.
Yeah.
But the one thing we're pretty sure of now is that it's probably not hormones, which has been the dominant kind of theory.
Right.
That one seems to have crashed and burned.
In some ways, I mean, it's very exciting that you've been able to find evidence that it's something, but I guess it also makes the search so much wider now because you don't know.
Yeah, everyone's been focused on this one kind of silver bullet answer that was hormones, and it doesn't seem to be. On the plus side, I think it is quite nice that I was getting, as someone that had been involved in so much of that work, I was getting really fed up seeing it portrayed in the media, for example, as hormones make women indecisive and things like that. So it's been nice to kind of scotch that idea and send that crashing and burning.
What kind of questions do you ask about rating attractiveness? Do you tend to ask ones which look at more short-term attraction rather than long-term relationships?
It really depends. I mean, you tend to find in some of the work we just ask about sort of attractiveness. How attractive do you think this person is on a scale of 1 to 7, say? And there's a bunch of kind of interesting things that we find with that. So, first of all, straight women, gay women tend to rate men's attractiveness in much the same way when you use those sorts of tests.
Okay.
And also other guys, even straight guys, also tend to rate guys' faces in much the same way. So I think there's an aspect of when we're just sort of rating general attractiveness that seems to be sort of dumb to our sexual tastes or sexual orientations. And it might be tapping something more fundamental about whether or not you think the person's nice or fair or trustworthy or whatever. And we also tend to find that if you give people, those sort of tasks you can give rats or train monkeys to do, where they'll press a button for food, press a lever for food, or drug reward or something. Well, we find that we can not train people, but people will expend effort, they'll work, they'll press buttons to look at faces that they think are attractive. And also they'll press buttons and they'll work to keep those faces on the screen, and they'll press buttons and exert effort to get rid of faces that they don't like the look of. So there's definitely something kind of meaningful that those attractiveness ratings are tapping. But in other work, we do sort of separate it out when we're looking at sort of specifically at sort of sexual attraction. And we do sort of separate it out into sort of long-term attractiveness. And it's a bit of an artificial distinction, but it does seem to map onto sort of real-world outcomes. But how attractive do you think this person is for a long-term relationship like cohabitation? How attractive do you think this person is for something like a one-night stand or or a one-off date or something? And there you do sort of see different patterns of results. So coming back to your earlier point about masculinity, femininity, women tend to show slightly stronger preferences for masculine guys for one-off dates, casual sex, things like that, but prefer relatively feminine guys for long-term relationships. And we've seen some evidence that does map onto sort of real-world partner choices.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. What kind of thing would you recommend in terms of, because lots of students use dating apps, like Tinder, for example, where you have that initial first impression picture. So I was wondering if you had any advice for people about what you should have as your first picture that people see.
I think a lot of it's to do with, I mean, it's easy to think of lots of things that you shouldn't do. But I've never used Tinder, but having seen some of the photos when other people have showed me, you're kind of like, that one's
like
difficult to see what, difficult to see what that person was thinking. I think like there is a big part of it is sort of standing out, and also obviously sort of being yourself and things. In terms of sort of online dating profiles, we've actually just finished a project looking at, it just came out a couple of days ago, looking at what sort of things people say in dating profiles in general, online dating profiles, and looking at that, and also looking at what sort of things people respond positively or not positively to. And one of the things that we found that people, both men and women, responded quite negatively to when men and women mentioned it was sex, which was kind of surprising in a way. But if you mention sex in your profile, then that's you can imagine it. You can stereotypically, you would imagine it would be a turn off to women looking for a guy. But I think one of the things that we were quite surprised by was that guys also responded to that so negatively. That was quite surprising.
Is it just when it's explicitly stated, or is
yeah,
it
I think
subtle?
I think exactly. If you're a little bit more nuanced or I nearly said underhand, that's not quite what I meant. But I think if you're a bit more subtle about it, then maybe it's a different thing. But I think it's just one of these things where you're kind of like, for both sexes, like that's immediately setting alarm bells off.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Especially considering, because I think supposedly there are different dating apps for different purposes, and Tinder is meant to be quite a one-night stand, hook-uppy one. So did you look across different dating platforms?
No, but that would be really cool to look at that. Yeah. That would be really nice. And one of the problems that we had with that project was that to get ethical approval for it, we can't divulge what platform it was that we were using.
Okay.
But that's that would be a great thing to look at in the future. Yeah,
I always find it interesting. I think, like you're saying, when it's a more unique profile on Facebook and the internet, it's very jokey, quite in some ways nerdy profiles become very popular because people really like to see something a bit out there. Yeah,
certainly humour came across as one of the things that people generally responded quite, and it didn't even, I think that was the thing I was quite struck by, was it didn't even need to be a successful attempt at humour. I think it just needed trying to be funny So I thought that was quite sweet, really.
Yeah, that's nice. Did you look at opening lines as well? Or
No,
mostly
we didn't
just
actually. That'd be
profiles?
interesting to look at what people say, where people. Yeah, it was a kind of automated text analysis thing that we used. Yeah, but now that we've run the sort of bottom up analyses, it would be cool to look and see at what, do people put their best foot forward, or that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think a quite successful one that one of my friends uses is she'll ask. It will be like a common debate, so like cats or dogs or something like that, to try and get people talking in a not non-threatening, but kind of an easy-going but still quite interesting topic.
Yeah. So I've been married since online dating really took off. So I haven't used it much. I haven't used it at all. But obviously lots of my friends do, and I'm just always appalled at just how bad some of them are at it. I was out with a friend. This was over in Canada. Out with a friend for brunch, and we're having a very nice brunch. He's texting with a woman that he'd met through an online dating app, and what was it she said? She said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm here. I'm just having brunch with my friend." And she said, "Oh, I'm having brunch," and she sent a photo of her brunch. And I said to him, "Oh, you should just say that like you wish you'd gone out for brunch with her instead of me."
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Oh, that's much better than what I said." And and then I said, "What did you say?" And he said, "Oh, I said that I thought your brunch looked rubbish." And you're just like, that's just not a like.
That's such a random thing. It's not even like a flirty come down.
Yeah,
It's just like,
yeah,
you made bad food choices.
Yeah, totally. It's just like this is not going to end. Actually, it did end well. He met his wife, but it did work out well in the end. But I can only assume he got better over time.
Maybe she found it endearing, or knew that he had high brunch standards, which is also if you like brunch, then
status signal.
Yeah, I was also wondering. I read this book by Aziz Ansari, who's a comedian.
Oh yeah.
He wrote. It's more a sociological than a psychological book called Modern Romance, about how dating is changing in modern times because of social media and changing cultural norms. But he was saying that this was written a few years ago. I think things might have changed slightly now. But initially, Tinder was considered a very superficial platform because you just look at a picture of a person and then decide yes or no, and then try to find out more about them. But his argument was that people always do that. So when you first enter a room, often on first glance, you'll see someone and think, okay, they're attractive, they're not, and then change your behaviour to...
Yeah, I mean, it's just a different type of sort of first impression. I mean, I think there's just always a lot of alarm about new technology and how new technology's been applied. Like when I was a kid, it was, video nasties and horror movies on video was going to rot the nation's youth's brains. Then computer games, and now it seems to be social media and things like that. There's a lab down in Oxford, Amy Orben, and Andrew Shabilsky, who've been doing a lot of work looking at things like whether or not use of social media, screen time, and all of these things have any negative effect on well-being and things. And I think they find that actually eating potatoes has a bigger negative effect on that was one of their control conditions. That has a bigger negative effect on young people's well-being than things like social media, online dating and things. So
oh wow, that's very interesting.
So I think it is just one of these things that it's new, and some people are immediately suspicious about it. But just as you point out, it's not really that new.
Yeah.
There's a thing that was, just when you mentioned this sort of sociology and things, my background's in psychology. Lisa's background's more in sort of biology, and our lab's kind of a mixture of people that do that with a sort of a smattering of kind of computer science people as well. But I was reading a sociology and demography paper the other day that was talking about how there's this kind of theory that sex is getting cheaper in the context in terms of sort of biological markets. Not actually people pay less for it, but that there's more sex, people are having sex earlier, and things like that. And actually the evidence seems to be really weak for that kind of idea. Men in particular seem to be having sex less often and later than they were some time ago. So,
Yeah.
And I think that again is a kind of pointing towards this idea that, just because of online dating and things like that, and it's easier to reach out to people than it has been, but that's not the same as saying people are necessarily going to make bad choices.
Yeah. I think it's a different kind of intimacy as well. So some people may feel very emotionally intimate with someone even if they've never met them, which is a different, maybe before the actual physical closeness of being with someone, which had to happen for you to be able to be emotionally intimate with them because you had to be in the same room, or that kind of thing may have led to different kind of situations and relationships than what's available to people now.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
These things change.
Do you find much of a variation between people of different ages
in terms of what they're
attractive? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. One of the things we find is that, an obvious one is that things in the face to do with age, older people respond differently to than younger people.
Okay.
So, characteristics that make the person look a little bit older people tend to be more positive about those than younger people are. Although in both sexes, youth tends to be preferred. But yeah, what people are attracted to, it does seem to sort of change over the lifespan. Where we've done the most kind of work has been looking at changes around sort of puberty. There's this kind of theory that around puberty, as sex hormones increase, that you'll see face preferences and mate preferences suddenly become much more kind of adult-like. Whereas actually what we tend to see is that it's not a kind of, it's much more gradual than that, and they seem to emerge before puberty. So, I think that's also trying to move. So I think those data are kind of moving our understanding of attractiveness away from it being a kind of mating-driven kind of behaviour towards something that might just be more about sort of social interaction and things in general. We tend to think about attraction in terms of sexual and romantic attraction, but it might just be more about, it might be that attractiveness judgments are primarily being driven by, things that you just need to know about, or judgments you need to make about people to be able to interact with them well, regardless of whether or not that's a sort of a sexual interaction or a romantic one, or something more like sharing food or deciding if they're trustworthy or not.
Do you find that people tend as well to do you ask them to rate, I assume, trustworthiness and friendship?
We're doing a lot of work at the moment on trustworthy. So there's a model of kind of how people judge faces that suggests that really, when people are judging faces, they're really just judging them on two different dimensions. One that's kind of trustworthiness. Do you think this person wants to do you harm or good? And the other dimension being dominance, which is, if this person wanted to, it's basically physical strength. Like if this person wanted to inflict harm on you, could they? And there's a guy, Alex Todorov, out at Princeton in the US, has done some work supporting that kind of model. It's really kind of his model. And we replicated it very straightforwardly in the UK. But when we did it in China, we found a slightly different pattern of results. We found that this sort of trustworthiness dimension was still there, but instead of a sort of strength or physical dominance dimension, it was more about kind of social status.
Okay.
And sort of social status and intelligence. So there's this guy, Chris Chartier, in the States, who became very disillusioned at the state of kind of his area in social psychology and how, it was just lots of little research studies. So he went for a run and was thinking about what he could do to make it better. And he came back from his run and thought, he's very active on Twitter, and he said, I'm going to tweet something and say, does anyone want to get together and we can all try and work on some bigger projects together, a bit like and he said, you know, it would be nice to do it like, you know, CERN, the big physics laboratory where they all work together.
Yeah.
We do like a CERN for psychology. And he went to put his kid to bed and came back, and his Twitter just totally blown up with people going, yeah, we'll do that. So me and Lisa, and so they said, well, okay, let's have people propose projects. So me and Lisa proposed the first project to be chosen to be run through this scheme. Mm-hmm. They've now got like 400 or so labs signed up.
Wow, that's amazing.
So it's to basically look and see across, and the labs are from all over the world. So it's basically to look and see if this kind of dominance-valence model, we know it doesn't replicate in China, or it partially does, but partly doesn't. Mm-hmm. So it's really to look and see whether or not that partner results, where it does hold up and where it doesn't hold up. And I think that's where the most exciting developments are going to come from, I think, is like lots of researchers kind of working together to do this. It's been good fun as well. Like, you know, me and Lisa have been working on this for quite a while, and then you work with people with different skills, different expertise, different backgrounds, different stages of their career and stuff. So as well as, you know, that makes the project better. But also like learning quite a lot about how to do my own work better as well. So it's been really, really rewarding. Are
you expecting any places to have a major difference to the research findings that you found here?
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't made any very strong predictions about what we'll expect to see. Mm-hmm. I think, and one of the things that we're trying to do, it's really a kind of a descriptive project. In a lot of ways, we just see what we see. Mm-hmm. But then what we're planning to do is to release details about the data before they're published, so that other people can pre-register predictions about what cross-cultural variables might be. You know, because it might be, you know, countries differ in things like gender equality, homicide risk. You know, you can imagine that maybe the dominant strength thing's more important in countries with high homicide risk or something like that. So we're kind of hoping that we'll create this resource. I think it'll be an interesting project in and of itself, but it also create a resource that a lot of people can do sort of further work on. Yeah. It's been fun.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. Do you use a mix of faces from different ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that was one of the things that we, the original work, the work we did in China was done with all Chinese faces. The work that had been done in the UK and the States was done with all white faces. So we've used a much more, as well as having greater diversity in the raters, we've also gone for greater diversity in the faces. So it's a real mix of ethnicities. And it'll be interesting to look and see how you know, if there's own race biases and things that play into that. Yeah. So it should be a good data set for, I think people will be analysing it for quite a long time into the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Once we're done with it.
Do you try to model I'm assuming you do some digital manipulation of the features to make them more masculine. Do you base them on real faces?
Yeah, so the way that it's one of the things actually I think sometimes people, particularly in the media, often misunderstand about the work on masculinity, femininity, is that it's not, because you get people saying, oh, but isn't masculinity or femininity a sort of social construct? And to some extent it is. And particularly the way it's often used in sort of common parlance. The way we experimentally manipulate them, we're manipulating something more like sexual dimorphism, which just means actual physical anatomical differences between male and female. So the classic example of sexual dimorphism in the non-human literature is peacocks. The male of the species, they're bright and colourful, and peahens, the female of the species, are really they're not bright and colourful at all. They're like little brown, inconsequential looking things. So the way that we manipulate masculinity, femininity is we use computer graphic techniques to make an average of, say, 100 young adult male faces and 100 young adult female faces. And then the software can really just analyse it. It defines the shapes by sort of 200 landmark points on each face. And just like any point on a graph has got an X and a Y coordinate, any point on the face has got an X and a Y coordinate.
Right.
So it just moves, you know, it can say, well, for all of these 200 points or so, it knows what the differences are between male and female, and they're really quite, like, they're not physically big differences. They look quite small, but when you manipulate them, even by just a small amount along those dimensions, it has a really pronounced knock-on effect onto perception.
That's really interesting.
But we've been kind of moving away from the computer graphic stuff recently. They're really good for telling you what information people can use to form impressions about faces. So, you know, if you masculinize and feminize a version of a woman's face, and then you say which one looks more trustworthy, I'll pick the feminine version. Which one looks more attractive? Most people pick the feminine version. Which one looks more physically strong? Most people pick the masculinized version. But that's when the faces don't differ on any other dimensions. But of course, faces differ. Two people's faces differ on tons and tons of different dimensions, not just the one you're manipulating. So what we're finding actually is that although those experimental manipulations, you get very, very robust effects and you get really strong effects, they don't translate very well to judgments of even static faces under other conditions when they vary on different dimensions.
Right.
So femininities, you know, you often read in the literature that femininity is synonymous. It's literally the same thing as attractiveness in female faces.
Right.
When you experimentally manipulate it, that's what you see. But if you measure femininity from women's faces, so we've just finished a study where we had 600 women's faces rated for attractiveness, and we can measure femininity using the same sort of techniques that we use to manipulate it. And there we find that, you know, when women's faces vary on other dimensions, like, you know, skin tone or whatever, that femininity is actually a pretty rubbish predictor of women's attractiveness. So I think there's been a real I think it's a problem that so much of the research in the past is focused on these experimental techniques.
Yeah.
I think it's it's unsurprising given that most of the people working on it are experimental psychologists.
Yeah.
But when you talk to people like the ecological psychologists or the anthropologists or the sociologists, they've long had concerns about the kind of ecological validity of these computer graphic manipulations, and I think our new work's suggesting that we probably should have been listening to them for longer than we have been.
Even just thinking about sort of fashion changes to do with facial presentation, so like eyebrows.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Because I think in the 2000s it was very considered very attractive to have quite a thin, for women anyway.
Yeah.
A thin line, but now more recently, much
heavier
thicker eyebrows. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Like, yeah, and I mean you do see these, and also, you know, not just in sort of grooming, you know, because that's something that you could sort of, well, you can manipulate. But I think if you look at how body shape, you know, what media portrayal of ideals of body shape, particularly for women, have changed over time.
Yeah,
it's quite. Although I say particularly for women, actually, if you look at like the Star Wars figures from when I was a kid, like Han Solo and Luke Skywalker were pretty wimpy kind of guys, whereas if you look at the new version of their action figures, they're like totally
really
ripped.
massive. Yeah. Now lots of actors, I'm sure it was, you know, it existed before, but in the 50s and things, they had to go through some semi-physical training, but mostly it was for function. But now actors in any role at all, like especially superhero movies, it's insane the transformations they go through to build like the Superman aesthetic.
It's pretty amazing when you think of like someone like Christian Bale, how much he's changed his body shape for different
roles.
And for this new, I think partly it's prosthetics in the new part, but even so, like he definitely looks like he's playing Dick Cheney in the new film Vice, and you can tell he's like been hitting the pies quite hard, in order to bulk up for that. But then in other ones, you see him, go back to American Psycho, and he's pretty ripped, you know.
Yeah, and in another movie, didn't he?
The Machinist, where he dropped pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds. Yeah, I mean, he was like emaciated in that one.
Yeah. Do you find a massive difference in ages as well between that kind of thing? So maybe people who were, you could say, in their sexual prime in the 2000s or something, they'd have more of a preference for the fashions that existed then.
It's not really something that we've looked at. We've looked at kind of those kind of like experiential effects on preferences. So you can induce preferences quite quickly in the lab just by showing people faces of a certain type. You can make them find those faces more normal, and as a consequence of that makes them more attractive. And we've done other work looking at kind of like imprinting on parental characteristics and things like that. It would be really, really interesting to look at how. So if I've understood you right, you're talking about, you know, like people who, when they first became sexually active, what they encountered then. Yeah, that would be a really cool thing to look at. We're involved in a project with some sex researchers over at Queen's University in Canada, looking at there's a theory and there's some evidence for it from non-human animals and a little bit of evidence for it in women, and we're trying to do a bigger study to look at this, that where women are in their menstrual cycle when they first encounter a particular male might influence how attracted they are to that male in the longer term.
Okay.
So the idea is that if women encounter a guy for the first time while they're ovulating, then they might be more positively disposed to that guy in the future than would otherwise be the case. I'm pretty sceptical. The evidence, the studies that have been done so far have been pretty small scale. But yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen if it happens or not.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting idea. But like I said, I'm sceptical about it. But
yeah, I wonder as well when people's preferences in terms of how old they are as well kind of solidify, because there's the myth of, well, personally, I believe it's a myth that everyone has a type.
Yeah.
In terms of personality and facial appearance and physical appearance, but from the little reading I've done about it, it seems to be like people have cognitive biases, which is when they're in a relationship, they go, no, this person I'm with now is definitely my type. And looking back, all of my past relationships were in some way like this person now.
Yeah, we've written a bit about that. We haven't done much work on it. We've done work on whether or not you can predict what a person's partner will be like by the type of faces they say they find attractive. And there we find that you can. And that could be that people, like, it could be exactly what you're saying. It could be that people are deciding what, they've got a type, so that comes through in how they rate faces and it comes through in their partner. Or it could be that, like, once you're in a relationship, you kind of say, yeah, that's what I was looking for all along, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, and we've seen there's some evidence for both. There's some evidence. So there's a group over in Göttingen in Germany that I visited in October. Lars Penka, who used to be based in Edinburgh actually before he moved back to Germany, and Tanya Gerlach. They've done work showing that you can look at women's mate preferences at this point in time, and then look at what partners they then go on to get, and that their mate preferences in the lab seem to predict their partner choices in the future. So that suggests that there is something about having a type. But then there's other work that we've done that suggests that, this is not a nice way to say this, that more people who are themselves more attractive, particularly women who are themselves more attractive, are better able to get the type of partners that they would like. And that makes sense. It's just it's not a very nice way to talk about these things, but people often when they're talking about relationships and mating, talk about biological markets, which is just basically you've kind of got a market value.
Yeah.
And that dictates to some extent what And your market value is not just determined by what you look like or anything. It's also, it's how nice you are and, how much money you've got and all kinds of things. But yeah, that does seem to sort of play into what sort of partners you can get. And,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of sobering when, you test a bunch of men and women and then get the partners into the lab and you're like, oh, it was pretty clear from the analyses we did that the more attractive people are more like, and particularly more attractive women were much more likely to end up with a better fit between their type, in inverted commas, and their actual partner.
I think in some ways people get quite distressed when they see couples who they think are mismatched in terms of their physical attractiveness. Like
It's quite striking it's two things. It's quite striking when you see couples like that. But just like you're saying, like some people get really quite annoyed about it.
Yeah.
Which I find quite weird. It's always interesting if you're like walking down Sauchiehall Street or something on a Friday or Saturday night, and you see couples like that are kind of mismatched in terms of attractiveness. And then once you pass them, if you turn around and you just see like just how many groups of people walk past them and like as soon as they're past them, like nudge them and nudge their pal and be like, oh, did you see that?
Yeah.
Like it's did you see them? What a weird couple.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is really strange that and I think that is because people are so intuitively aware of these kind of market forces. And you see these things that kind of buck the trend, then people can't help but speculate. But yeah, I've noticed that it's not. It goes beyond people wondering why. Like people genuinely seems to cause them affront.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of not a jealousy necessarily, but they feel that they've worked with their own market value and have had to accept things that maybe they are unhappy with, and then when they see two people who aren't paying attention to those rules.
It's funny though, you really get the impression for some people it really kind of rocks their world.
Yeah.
Like it's curious.
Yeah. I did a little mini experiment myself where I did a face symmetry test online. And I was going to ask what your findings about facial symmetry are, because I've heard that it's supposedly biologically a marker of good genetics.
Yeah. So the idea, the sort of theory is, and you see it in, the theory comes from, not from human studies, it really comes from studies of mate choice and mate preferences in non-human animals, and particularly from sort of birds and even insects. And the idea is that, we're kind of genetically programmed to develop symmetrically, with a few exceptions. Heart tends to be on one side. But our fingers generally should be roughly the same length on each hand and things. But the environment and illnesses and things kind of impinge on us, and we all grow up a little bit wonky. Some of us grow up wonkier than others, and the theory is that those are the ones that the people that grow up more asymmetric have either been exposed to more illnesses, or they're less well able to withstand illnesses.
Okay. So
that's where the idea that symmetry might be some sort of marker of the ability to maintain good health.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good to have a healthy partner, and it's particularly good to have a healthy partner if you're going to have kids, because it means you're more likely to have healthy kids. That's in a short version. That's the kind of story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that when you experimentally manipulate symmetry in faces, so you make a face slightly more perfectly symmetric, it tends to look better than the original version.
Mm-hmm.
If you exaggerate the natural asymmetries in a face, because everyone's face is asymmetric to some extent, then it very, very, very quickly becomes quite almost freakish looking when you exaggerate them.
I found I definitely have I think my right side is my best side, but my left side, when it's flipped, makes me look like an ogre.
Yeah. So when you there's two ways you can make faces. You can manipulate symmetry in faces. One way is to, like the way you have, you split it down the middle,
mm-hmm.
mirror flip them and stick them together.
Mm-hmm.
That way, that's how people did the early work on symmetry. and found that symmetry didn't actually seem to matter much, and actually might even be, in some of the studies, came out as unattractive. And the reason for that is that when you mirror flip them and stick them back together, it gives the faces kind of unnatural proportions.
Yeah.
So if you do it with... So my brother broke his nose when he was a kid, and if you do it with my brother's face, then one of the versions comes out with like 3 nostrils. His face is so sort of wiped across his face.
Right.
The other way you can do it is take the face and just use computer graphics to warp it into a perfectly symmetric shape, and that keeps the proportions natural.
Yeah.
And there you do see a slight advantage for symmetry. People tend to choose the perfectly symmetric version over the asymmetric version about 60% of the time or something like that. So it's a bit of a slight bias, but not a big one. But symmetry is a really good example of one where a trait where you get reliable effects when you manipulate it, but when you measure it and there's lots of other stuff going on with the face, it doesn't seem to actually matter so much.
Yeah, it's very, when you consider how attractive a person is, I mean, these experiments are really fascinating and reveal a lot about how we feel about different people and first impressions, but it's never going to be just one person's face or just their face that you interact with. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we've been moving more towards, like, and increasingly towards trying to look at the sort of full, I nearly said the full package, but the, like looking at how people integrate voice, body, face, and things like that. Because just like you're saying, it's you end up studying, if you study faces or you study voices or you study bodies, you end up knowing a lot about how people perceive these kind of artificial stimuli, but not very much about how people pull all that kind of information together. And particularly, a lot of so as a consequence, we know a lot about how people perceive standardised faces with neutral expressions and direct gaze, but it's only recently we've started to learn a little bit about how people integrate information about gaze direction, emotions, and all the stuff that we know is important. And because we knew it was important, people controlled for it, but because we controlled for it, we now don't actually know very much about how people use it.
Yeah.
So I think those sort of moving and developments in computer graphics and social robotics and things like that really kind of allow people to do this work in a way with a level of sort of realism that you weren't able to even sort of 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. What does your research show about makeup and kind of more less natural, let's say, like facial features that people might try and accentuate?
Yeah, I mean, it's so some of the things we find with makeup are that, like, it does seem to. There's always been an argument that women use it to exaggerate their attractiveness around ovulation. Mm-hmm. That seems to definitely not be a robust finding. It's there in there's actually debate about whether or not it's even there in the original research that claimed to show it, but it certainly doesn't sort of replicate. And there was also a lot of work being done on suggesting that women might use it to either enhance or obscure cues to their health in faces. And again, that one doesn't seem to stand up particularly well either. So I think a lot of these ideas that makeup's exaggerating existing biological signals don't seem to be sort of standing up to much scrutiny. Mm-hmm. But what makeup does seem to do is to exaggerate sex differences in facial appearance. Okay. So eye makeup and brow makeup and brow shaping seem to exaggerate existing differences in facial contrast in the eye region. And in fact, actually, there's a guy, Alex Jones, coming up from Swansea next month to give a talk on mostly that. Okay. It's actually what he studies, is the role makeup plays. And the other thing that really comes out of his work is that makeup might play more of a role in signalling personality and things to other women than it does about attracting men.
Yeah, I have a friend who says I used to wear makeup to dates because I thought it would make me look like my best self, but I've noticed that the only people that ever notice when I'm wearing makeup are girls, and they'll compliment me on my eyeshadow and be like, "Oh, that's really great technique," but the men or the boys never actually notice whether she's wearing it or not.
So that's pretty much what his work shows, is that the effect of makeup, comparing makeup, subtle makeup, heavy makeup, and no makeup, has a much stronger effect on women's perceptions of women than it does on men's perceptions of women.
But then I wonder how that translates into lesbian couples, because maybe then that's
a good question.
Element.
Yeah, I know it's something that he'd like to look at. It's one of the things that it is one of the big gaps in the literature, is just generally how a lot of the research is quite sort of heteronormative and heterocentric. Partly that's comes from the sort of theories it's come from, which tend to be about reproduction, but that's really changing in the last sort of couple of years. We've published a few things now on looking at non-straight people, and there's even work coming out now on the on the kind of third gender from Samoa, the Fa'afine, who are a colleague, Tony Little's been doing. So yeah, I think it's one of the things that, if I could have my time again and go back and do all my research again, I wish I'd sort of taken on board. It's a shame when you look back on it and you see how sort of heteronormative so much of the literature is, often for just sort of practical reasons. But yeah, we've got a few projects running in the lab at the moment, looking to see how well. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is a lot of these kind of what you see as written about well-established sex differences in mate preferences, looking to see how those play out when you look at queer participants. I think would be really interesting.
Especially I think transgender participants would be very
great.
Interesting to look at, because I wonder whether there's any way transgender people can not select but can encourage certain traits to develop, because some people can be transgender without or identify as transgender without hormone therapy, whereas others will choose to go through hormone therapy to look more like the gender they feel themselves to be. I think these are all really important topics, and it's kind of crazy that they've not really had the full recognition in the literature that they really sort of should have. Unfortunately. It can change going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Onwards and upwards.
It will be really interesting to see as well with your research, your global research at the moment, how kind of more cultural changes and globalisation may contrast to previous literature as well.
Yeah, we've got colleagues that have done a little bit of work on that have found that sort of industrialisation and sort of urbanisation might be a better word, of regions that when you look at sort of small scale societies, hunter-gatherer societies and things, they're really not that interested or engaged with appearance.
Okay.
Partly because they don't have to individuate people so much, because there's not that many of them.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of theory emerging. I think it's a really nice idea, and I don't think the data are terribly convincing yet. But I think it is a really engaging idea. This idea that this kind of focus on appearance and things like attractiveness and using faces to make first impressions about people might be a kind of byproduct of moving to larger scale societies where that's more important, because you don't know everybody.
Yeah.
I think that is a really interesting idea, sort of to look at, something I'd be really keen to work on in the future.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
Yeah, thanks for your time. Cheers.
Yeah, and I'll link some of your research below so people can read about it.
Oh dear.
And and maybe sometime in future when you get more data about the research you're doing, you can come back and tell us.
Yeah, come back and get you up to speed.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for your time there. Cheers.
The Psych Soc O'Clock podcast was created by Amelia Hilton in association with the Glasgow University Psychology Society. This conversation was recorded by Amelia Hilton and Professor Ben Jones. It was produced by Amelia Hilton and edited by Jack Harding, with original music by Jack Harding. It was recorded in the University of Glasgow School of Psychology and Neuroscience Faculty Speech Lab.